Good afternoon, and welcome to Day 4 of Green Week 2017. This is our 6th year, and in a moment I'll introduce our speaker, Z. He's only the second speaker that we've actually had return. Many of you will remember his presentation, which was focused kind of on the 2030 challenge about 2 years ago. So I'll introduce him in a moment, but before I do, I wanted to take a second and acknowledge our sponsors. We've got 5 signature sponsors, all of whom, have made this possible, made Green Week possible. They are the reason that we can make this happen. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge a couple of them and introduce a few folks that are actually present today in the audience. So the first one is Shildan, and they make terracotta rain screen products and sunscreens. And with us today are Drew Dawson and Jen Marchesani. If you could stand up for a moment. Well, I think they're around here somewhere. There we go. Thank you. Okay, and we also have with us today from USG, who obviously they provide gypsum wallboard and acoustical ceiling products. And we've got Casey Skelton here with us today. Casey, thank you so much. And then our other 3 signature sponsors are Technion, who provide furniture for the workplace, Tarkett with flooring solutions, and Gate Precast, who obviously make precast panels, both architectural and structural. Today I also wanted to acknowledge we have an event sponsor for today's event, and that is Shaw Contract. And we've got 3 folks here today. I'm going to have Carrie Johnson come up with 2 of her colleagues. I think she'll introduce each of them. And I just want them to kind of briefly introduce their products and talk for a minute.
Thank you. You guys can come up. Just really quickly, I want to say on behalf of myself, Carrie Johnson, Jesse Kane, and Melissa Now, we appreciate being you guys inviting us to be a part of this. And just to give you a little bit of information about us, about Shaw Contract, why we have 3 people is we work with you guys in your different studios. I work with the corporate and the sports team. So if you guys are a part of those teams, then please come see me and introduce yourself. Jesse works with healthcare and government and institutional. And then Melissa works with your hospitality groups. So we have been really honored to be a part of the Mindful Materials with you guys from the very beginning, and we hope to continue those efforts. And we have a few new collections that we're showing in the back that I want you guys to come by and see. Healthy building materials, sustainable cradle-to-cradle products. So please come by, say hi, and take a look at our new stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment to introduce Z. Z Smith is a principal and director of sustainability and building performance at SQ, Dumez, and Ripple. The firm was the winner of the 2014 AIA Firm Award. His built work includes academic, laboratory, and residential buildings, earning LEED Gold and Platinum certification. I'm going to tell you about his background, but Z kind of coasted. He kind of picked out the easy universities to go to, and I don't know. Z's one of the most passionate and brilliant people I've met, but I'm going to give you a little of his background. So his training and experience in physics at MIT. He has a degree in engineering at Princeton, and also an architecture degree from University of California, Berkeley. So, yeah, he coasted. He's also the inventor on 10 patents. He's an author of over 50 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He teaches at the Tulane School of Architecture. He's former chair of the U.S. Green Building Council of the Louisiana chapter, and serves on the National Advisory Group for the AIA Committee on the Environment. So despite being one of the most brilliant people I think I've come across, he's also extremely passionate and extremely approachable. I mean, you can just walk up to him and have a conversation about anything. He's a very humble and magnificent person. So with that, I'll turn it over to Z. And
Thank you, Roy.
yeah, see if you can live up to that.
Great. Here's the clicker. Okay, I think we're next. Great. So thank you very much. That's incredibly kind. And some of it was true. When Roy called me back, I really enjoyed visiting, and I was so impressed with all the work that you all are doing at HKS. When Roy called me and invited me to come back, and he said, well, our theme is beauty and performance, and I know that at Escudumas Ripple, you've been kind of working that into how you position your firm and what you're trying to do. And so we thought it would be great to have you come back. And I knew how to give that talk about beauty and performance, where we pursue design excellence, but we also underscore that with metrics. But that's a talk I've given before. And so, the talk I really want to go to is, instead of talking about feeling beauty and measuring performance, the talk I'd pay money to hear is measuring beauty and feeling performance. And so I sent that title in, and then immediately after I pressed send said, uh-oh. It challenged me to look around at some things that are kind of interesting that I think that are going on. And so I'll share some of that with you. And then I hope at the end we can have a fun conversation. The other thing I want to do is just say again how much we look to HKS and how much I admire what the firm has been doing. I will say we had a presentation from a purveyor of terrazzo, the leading one in the country. And they did the lunch and learn, and some of our interiors people, just kept going at them and saying, yeah, but do you have an HPD on that? And what about this? And what happens to the workers who install this? And they said, God, there's only one other company that's given us so much trouble. It's this big company, HKS. And I said, great. Who are really raising the bar in the questions we ask. And as I think it's Ann Hicks Harney says, if you don't know what's in it, maybe you shouldn't put it in your building. And so the work that you folks have done at pulling together in a coherent way with mindful materials has been, it turns this kind of jungle of different ideas into something that's accessible and organizable, frankly. And so we look a lot to that. Another thing is, I was saying, you guys keep picking up. You have a great green team here in Dallas. Increasingly, whenever I hear someone's leaving a great firm who is a sustainability leader at another firm and they're going to a new firm, it always turns out to be HKS. You guys are picking up the best leaders in sustainability. So Rand Ekman, who's always been a fantastic advocate for the 2030 challenge and 2030 commitment within the AIA, is now, I guess, based in your Chicago office. Julie Hiramoto, amazing person working on issues like post-occupancy post-occupancy evaluation, post-occupancy engagement. Someone I look to, her writings and her presentations. Upali Nanda worked on research based in your Houston office and so on. The values that you folks display are the values that we aspire to too, which is to say, we think great design and informed design can merge together, and that your consistent investment in research and in new tools through things like HKS Line, through generalized research, and then your research fellowships are all things that we admire in our firm, although we are one, trying to think what the ratio, I can't do the math, I'm too tired. We're a firm of 44 people. So we're a little smaller than HKS, but we look to the investments that you're making and the work that you're doing, and we try in our small way to zip around when you are the giant ocean liner working as you are at your scale. We're kind of the little speedboat zipping around. Just to introduce EDR, Escudumas Ripple, to y'all. The firm, I'm told, I like to say that I wasted the first 49 years of my life and then I moved to New Orleans about 7 years ago and joined EDR. The firm before Katrina was largely people who had been born in Louisiana, went to Louisiana schools, maybe did a little graduate work somewhere and then came back. Steve Demez famously said he came back from LA because the cost of shipping the crawfish was just getting to be too much. But after Katrina, a lot has changed in New Orleans, and it's still, I'm told from the people who were there before, has many of the great charms that it had, but it has a kind of vibrancy now that maybe wasn't there in that same kind of strength. Where people, very committed people, have been moving from all over the country and indeed all over the world to be part of the rebuilding efforts there. Our firm has been transformed in that way, where now our staff represent 40 different university programs from 5 different countries. We place a big emphasis on getting everybody licensed, promoting them through that, and now are up to 73% of our technical staff are LEED accredited, even though we're just about to start our first LEED project in 3 years. And so what I'd say is I know y'all, sometimes you have a huge portfolio of LEED work. We believe in following LEED as a discipline rather than necessarily always just a certification system. And I guess we're making some progress on our balance. I mentioned we believe in an investment in research. And when I was there and our firm was growing from 20 right after Katrina, we were about 35 when I joined in 2009. One of the associates of the firm, a young woman, said, the problem is there are all these questions I would like to ask, and I wish we had time to think more about, but we always just have these deadlines. And even if I try to cordon off, 2 hours a week or 2 hours a day even for doing the kind of investigation I need to be at the forefront of a question, I just can't stop. There's red lines that need to be picked up. There's a client meeting that has to be prepared for, and so on. And so to kind of stop ourselves, we realized that we could fund very economically a position, or sometimes 2 positions of each year we pick a theme with research of something we wish we understood better. And then we announce this theme, put out a call, and we get a different kind of recent graduate, typically. Or we can sometimes get people taking a year off, so we'll do a 12-month fellowship, and in some years also a 3-month fellowship. Sometimes that's somebody working in a summer. Sometimes it's in between undergraduate and graduate. Sometimes it's in between masters and moving on to their doctoral research. So we picked these themes: building performance, resilience, community engagement, the tiny topic of health in the built environment, and the most recent one that we're just wrapping up right now we call a civil landscape. And that is to say the intersection of urban design, green infrastructure, civil engineering, and landscape architecture. How do those all come together to make great public spaces that are also performative? So typically we're hiring in people with architectural training, but actually the most recent ones, this woman is a civil engineer who helped build the High Line in New York, and then went back to school after getting her civil engineering degree, working for 3 years building the High Line, and going back to get an urban design degree. And then she's been complemented with someone who has a landscape architecture degree, who then worked in community, actually here in Dallas, worked in community design, building basically parks and public spaces in communities that are underserved. And so having these people around and having, what we do is we say, for each of these topics, we believe there are, there's 100 books out there, or there's 50 books out there. Tell us which 3 we should all read. There's 200 great articles on this. Tell us which 20 we should be familiar with. So we have them do a deep dive research. They have no billables. They can plug into a project, but only to challenge it, to take it further. And then we require them to give away what they've found. And we have a series of lunch and learns typically once every couple of months. And they become, when people have questions, they go to them. I want to know more about this new stormwater zoning in this new zone, in this new area where we might be competing. Can you understand that for us and help us, put it in context, things like that. So it's been really energizing for us. So I'm in respect of, great respect of how your investments in research, and I see all the ways that you play that out as well. HKS and EDR, we share a lot, really, although we are wildly different sizes. We have both a challenging political climate in which we operate and a challenging meteorological climate in which we operate. And yet we're all trying to do good work to make the world better. Working in the climate that we do, when we see, some firm from, San Francisco doing great work, we're cheering them on, but I've lived in San Francisco. It's an easier environment to go make the case for some of the things we're trying to make the case for. And if we're going to change this country and change this world, it's about connecting to everybody, not just the already committed. We love Louisiana, our home. We practice nationally and now internationally. And one of the hallmarks of our own work is something I'm sure you try to do is with each project when you're working somewhere, try to understand the place and find how architecture can help connect people to place. So this is the Louisiana State Museum, that's the Art Deco 1930s era state capitol. We like to say that every good project at SQ Dumas Ripple has to have a porch, a courtyard, and a water feature. And so this one has all three, framing the view to the Capitol, and looks very bucolic. But sort of putting this in context, if you go up on the roof, this is what you see, right? So the reality is that we can frame the shot carefully to see how nice things are, but when we come up, this is the context you're in Texas, this is the context we're in Louisiana, where we're part of a larger world that's doing all kinds of stuff, and we want to be part of making that, sort of healing that. And so we have these two great dynamic forces in the Louisiana economy. Big chemicals and big timber is actually quite influential. And that notion of being able to connect to both of these things is important for us. So soon after I arrived at EDR, they said, Z, we've been doing what we think is sustainable, but it's been largely intuitive. We have no idea if it's actually working. And because you're that kind of numbers guy, could you maybe figure out how we're doing? And so that first summer of that first, we set about contacting some of our previous clients and said, can you send us your utility bills? And we started analyzing them. And the first one that I happened to have called was a laboratory project outside of Lafayette that we loved because it won all kinds of great design awards. And we got their bills and we analyzed them. And there it was. Its energy use intensity, or EUI, the amount of energy it uses per square foot per year, was about 1/2 of the typical laboratory building in the 2003 survey, which is sort of the basis that we all compare with, right? And the best part was that this building was completed in 1998, so it was compliant with the 2030 challenge before the 2030 challenge existed. So we said, boy, we are geniuses. So that's sort of, or as I said at the time, dumb luck. But we did well, and so that whetted everyone's appetite. It's good when the first time you try something, it's encouraging. So then we use that as a basis for saying, okay, now let's apply all the techniques today we have for simulation, all the other kinds of things we can do, and that was a project that was already fully designed, and I think I may have mentioned this one in my talk in our previous visit, and that day, I think, it won its Code Top 10 award. It was announced. This is a project that uses 1/3 as much energy as a typical laboratory building. And it does so a little bit through good design, having good bones, but this building was completely designed. It was at the end of CDs and had gone on hold awaiting funding. And what we then did was it came off hold as the funding got assembled, and the owner said, oh, there's a little bit money left in the budget. What can you do to lower my long-term operating cost? And could you do that LEEDs thing? And so we said, no, you can't do LEED at the end. You have to do it at the beginning. But we tried, and through a series of relatively modest investments, actually, with all the investments came with a 3-year payback, or the package of investments that we suggested. We're able to take it to this level of energy performance. And the key idea is it's a little bit technology, but it's a lot harvesting the intelligence of the most sophisticated building management system that exists, which is the occupants themselves. Meaning, we went to a world where every 1,000 square feet in this building, that occupant can set the ventilation policy, temperature and humidity control that's appropriate for the work they're doing. And rather than saying one size fits all, we let that level of granular control take over, and that allowed tremendous savings. Now, beauty and performance. In 2012, Steve Dumez, our design director, and one of our founding principals, was asked to be there's the COAT Top 10 Award, the Committee on the Environment jury, and they send all five, there's usually 5 or 6 members, there's usually one token engineer, a bunch of kind of greeny architects, and then the token design guy, or woman. The one who's only known for their design excellence, the sort of people who straddle both camps, and then the engineer. And Steve was given this huge packet of submissions. There were 65 submissions that year. And he said, you know, there's all these numbers. There's like a bucket full of numbers here. Can you make some sense out of these numbers and help me understand that? And I'm just going to go flip through the pictures for a while, and let's get back together in 2 days and talk about it. And so what he'd done is how he always does design crits is he looks and goes, he never says yes. He says no, or he says maybe. And so there were 2 buckets, and in the red were the no's. They just didn't speak to him. And that was about half the projects. They wouldn't make the first cut. And the other half were the maybes. And then we plotted up, this is the EUI reduction in the blue of the maybes, and the red is the didn't grab them. Interesting thing is that there's a huge spread. This is of the 65 submissions for the COAT that year. The interesting thing is that the mean EUI reductions were identical, and the spreads were identical. So the good news is, the great fear when I started to do this analysis was that the projects that performed the best would be the ugliest, right? Now, if you've read The Shape of Green by Lance Hosey, he talks about that at its best, green design, the thing that makes it beautiful is the thing that makes it high-performing, and that's something that I wish were true. But we've all seen projects that look sort of like a science fair project, that by tacking enough stuff on top of it, can get to a great energy performance that don't seem to hang together as design propositions. So to me, this weird bar chart, and it's been observed of me that for Z, a day without a bar chart is like a day without sunshine. But this bar chart is telling you that they can be completely uncorrelated, meaning we can have great energy performance and great design, or we can have terrible energy performance and great design. They're uncorrelated, and don't anyone tell you I can't make a great performing building, I need to spend the money on making it beautiful, or the other way around. That's, to me, a hopeful sign. So then we broadened this out to the whole firm, and we took a whole bunch of projects which were thought to be green buildings and compiled their actual energy use. Whenever we could find, not what the computer model said, but how did they really work. And we had sort of 15 or 20 or 30 projects in there, and we had the whole firm take this sort of taste test and rate them. Just, do these grab you from a design perspective? And then we didn't tell them what the energy performance was, but then we plotted them up. So this is energy use compared with the national average of that building type. This is 100% savings. This is the building used double. The California Academy of Sciences happens to use 1.5 times as much energy as a typical museum. The London City Hall, Foster, Rogers, anyway, the one that looks kind of like an armadillo, actually uses much more energy than the typical building out there. So again, the point isn't that some buildings got rated prettier than others. The point is there is no correlation between energy performance and how beautiful people, architects, design professionals thought they were. So again, we should let go of this notion that those things have to go in lockstep. It's our job to make them beautiful and to make them perform well. So let's talk numbers. After we had started compiled back through our back catalog, contacting owners, grunging through utility files and so on, we developed this little slide that says, here's the EUI that we measured for the building, and that's the national average for that building type. And sometimes our number was above what the national average for that building type was, and no problem, we always had lots of reasons why that was true, but it doesn't matter. We had this little chart, and sometimes we'd kind of flash this by owners during a job interview. But our business development director came on, and we hired a new one about 2 years ago, and she said, if you guys are serious, you're going to publish this on our website. We said, really? And we said, mm-hmm. So if you go to our website today, you can see the actual measured energy use of our portfolio. And wherever it's kind of tinted, it means we have a case study that you can read about what we've learned from studying that project. Now, y'all are signatories to the 2030 commitment. We are too. We started, doing our accounting and so on, and we were always disappointed. Two things. One is, remember the 2030 commitment, it adds up the energy use of your entire portfolio that was in design that year, and you add up how much energy it's gonna use according to the models. And if it's a big building, it has a bigger footprint and so on. But you add up that total number of BTUs, and then you compare that with, suppose we just take, for every K-12 school, if there's 100,000 square foot K-12 school in your design portfolio, you go back to the 2003 baseline government survey and you say, what was the energy use per square foot of a K-12 school? That size, okay, that's this much. So you're running against the average building that was out there in 2003. So this isn't about how much better are you than ASHRAE or some kind of hypothetical thing. It's a survey of real buildings. And you add that all up, and the goal that Esmendria threw down the gauntlet was they started at 50% savings, and then in 2010, the target became 60% energy savings, and then in 2015, it jumped to 70% energy savings. And yet each year, the AIA publishes, and that's here in blue, how much all of the hundreds of signatory firms on this, if you add all their portfolios together and keep them anonymous, how are they doing? And the answer is, not so great. Better than nothing, there's some energy savings there. But in fact, if you don't do anything, if you just build the code, the average building, if you build to the 2007 building code, you'll be 20% better than the average building that was in the inventory in 2003. So you get kind of a little free ride for doing almost, just not being illegal. So this was somewhat disappointing. So there's two parts, though, to the 2030 commitment. There's new building construction, where it's sort of assumed that the architect has sort of control over all the moving parts here. And then there's if you're doing renovation work, which is to say, if you're just doing an interior fit out, they figure that one thing you're definitely probably doing is changing the lighting. And so they say, we'll take the 90.1 2007 allowed lighting power density. We won't make you do models and stuff. We'll just say, add up all the light bulbs, pretend you turn them all on. How many watts did you use? Divide that by the area of the project, and that's lighting power density, LPD. And there we got really encouraged because we were pushing really hard adoption of good lighting strategies, LED lighting, wherever we could talk the client into it and so on. And so we said, oh, look, our savings are doing much better than code, even though in Louisiana we're still stuck on 2007. But we felt somewhat encouraged. But we said, what could we do more? Well, this is the 2016 result. And so, again, the market basket of all the firms out there that are reporting, it just came back from the AIA, it's creeping up a little bit. They haven't reported the lighting result out yet. That's not been published. But our lighting numbers are holding, and the fun thing for us, the bragging rights thing, is that our energy performance has shot way up. And so, not to repeat my talk from last time, but I'm here to tell you what we've done to get there. And to me, it's not that we're smart, it's that we said, what do we have to do to get better? And so we looked at the reports, and one of the things the report said was, if you don't model your project, under our current building code where we do most of our work, it's a 25% savings. But we found back in 2013 or 2014 that actually for the ones that we modeled, we were getting 44% savings. So we said, okay, we're just going to model everything. And we had the good fortune of hiring an architect who just couldn't help himself doing energy modeling. And so we started to model the projects where even the client was going to pay for energy modeling. We just did it. Now, there are nice tools out there that are simple. You start to get good numbers. Luckily, this particular staff member is a kind of a black belt in energy modeling, so we could do some relatively sophisticated modeling. But when we applied that, this is the percentage of our projects that are being energy modeled, and then this in each year is the portfolio average rising up. So I was telling Kirk earlier, Kirk Teskey, this notion that, the ideal diet, I've heard, there's the grapefruit diet and there's the Palm Beach diet. The one that I've heard works the best is the pencil diet. You can eat whatever you want so long as you write it down. Because when you write down 2 cookies, whatever it was, then you kind of have to face yourself by doing it. The act of measuring, the act of writing something down is transformative because all of a sudden your conscience kind of comes back at you and what choices are you making? And so, your mileage may vary, but for us, this idea of investing in modeling more of our stuff and not forcing anybody to do anything they can't, we're not forcing any clients to do things they aren't going to do, but we're just paying attention more. And that's what happens when you write down what you eat. You pay attention more, and you start to benefit from that notion of being attentive. So the summary from that is Peter Drucker, who said famously, you can't manage what you don't measure. The other thing is, as you know, I'm a recovering, as Roy mentioned, I'm a recovering physicist. So Werner Heisenberg had this thing called the uncertainty principle, and one of the things that you can't know with perfect accuracy simultaneously both the position of something and its momentum. And what's actually happening is if you try to confine its position, the act of confining it actually gives it momentum. And so if you infinitely confine its position, you have infinite uncertainty as to what its momentum is. So if you know where something is exactly, you don't know where it's about to go, or the other way around. If you know how fast it's moving, you don't know where it is perfectly. So that notion of the act of measuring, distorting what we're doing, there's sort of an analogy to that, and that's the story I just told, which is that if we do something where we actually measure stuff, it changes our behavior as designers. And to me, that's a good thing. So I'll give a couple examples of this. The act of measuring, changing what you're measuring. So this is a dog kennel. This is the dog kennel we are so proud of. This is the Adoption Center for the Louisiana SPCA. And one of the things that they said to us was, we got them kind of back online really quickly after Katrina in a Butler building, in a prefab building. It's assembled from the moment they said go to when they moved in 9 months. So we felt pretty great about that. And it had a very clever mechanical system, won a mechanical system design award, and so on. But they said the problem is we have frequent power outages in New Orleans. We have windstorms, we have hurricanes. And the building becomes almost uninhabitable. That building became almost uninhabitable because they couldn't open the windows because the prefab building didn't come with operable windows. And the building was big footprint, so even if they'd opened the windows, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. So they said, can you give us something so that when the power's out, can you give us a generator? And we said, yes, a bigger one. And we said, how about instead of a bigger one, we make a more efficient building? So the generator can stay a small part of your budget, but you can open the windows too. And they say, okay. So the forming of the building became about promoting cross-ventilation and natural light. And so then we used all these tools. And one of the tools that we used, and you guys are leaders in the development of new tools, one of the embarrassing things using Revit as our modeling program, I went to our head of BIM and I said, hey, the Revit model knows which of these windows are facing south, right? And which are facing west, right? And he goes, yeah. I said, can you tell me what fraction of our glass faces west on this project? And he said, no. I said, can you write a program that will stick its finger down the throat of Revit and cause it to disgorge the information that it's holding back from us? And so they did. And the team wrote this tool we call Glass Rose. So this is a wind rose, but it's for glass. It's telling you how much of the glass is facing which way. And this is a tool written in Dynamo, and then it spits out something that gets absorbed by Excel, which then compiles it. And then, of course, to be pretty, we can't resist, and we take it into Illustrator. But that tool then helped inform the selection. So our site on this project, the way the property was laid out, the majority of the mass had to face east and west, and yet 43% of the glass faces north, and a relatively small fraction southeast and west. And so in our hot climate, this allows us to have great daylighting with a minimum solar gain, and yet we're getting 82% spatial daylight autonomy, which means 82% of the time we can meet the lighting requirements of this project without turning the lights on, 82% of the occupied hours of the year. More importantly, though, is we should talk about other ways to quantify performance. So one of the goals is we had to have daylight where the doggies were. So cute. And then we said we're going to make it so that the dogs all have a view. And we're also going to make it so the dogs aren't facing each other, barking at each other. So we put sort of a playroom in the middle. And then the whole space is daylit and cross-ventilated. And so that notion, though, has had an interesting consequence, which is that here's the energy use of the phase one building. This is what we think is the CBEX baseline for phase two. this was our computer model, and then this is the measured energy use of this building, fully occupied. So it is 69% below this inferred CBEX benchmark. But this is the really important performance thing, which is that the fraction of animals that are of their intake that are successfully placed is up 72%, because it's a more pleasant, it's quieter, it's not scary. When you go into a typical animal shelter, one dog barks, they all start barking. You know, you've got your 4-year-old with you hoping to take home a puppy or a dog, and it just becomes deafening. Well, it's bad for the health of the dogs, it's bad for the health of the workers in that, and it frightens off customers. So this notion of each room, each dog gets its own room, each cat has a view to nature, but has its own space and a play space, has led to a higher a higher placement rate, and the fraction of the animals that are taken in that are euthanized is down 64%. So when we talk about performance, you know, I'm happy to talk about EUIs because that's how we're increasingly keeping score, but there's all these other kinds of performance, and I think you had a talk from someone from Delos, right? It's learning all the languages of performance that we're now asked as architects to take into account is key to, I think, our success. One of the other things I'll mention just in passing, since you had someone here from Delos, was when I first heard about the well building standard, I was very excited, but the thought of spending $100,000 to have somebody come once to measure the air quality in the building was fun. I mean, it's nice that we're doing that, but I knew things happen after that. We rented those super lab quality VOC, CO2, and PM 2.5 meters and walked around this building, and what we found was, in parts of it, in other words, in the parts where no one was that week, the levels are fantastic. But in the middle of the clinic wing, where they're using all kinds of interesting chemicals in a clinic, the VOC levels are actually pretty high, right? And so the notion that we can certify a building isn't good enough. We need tools that are going to allow us to monitor what's happening and provide feedback to the occupants so they understand the consequences of what they're bringing into their buildings. So that's the big message here is about performance. The other thing that I'm hoping Delos would have talked about is this amazing study. How many people have heard of this thing, the CogFX study, cognitive function study? Okay, we'll send this around. This is transformative. This wins you new work if you know about this stuff. This is a study coordinated by, it's called the Harvard study because a guy from Harvard put his name first, but it's actually mostly done in Syracuse at a research center, was funded by Carrier and the United Technologies. They made this thing that it's not going to win any design awards. This is a space that has, I think, 8 or 10 cubicles, windowless cubicles. And, but this is what's underneath those 10 cubicles, is they have complete control over the temperature, humidity, particulate level, VOC level, and CO2 levels of each cubicle independently. And they have test subjects come in and work for a week. And they have these interesting knowledge worker tasks where it's a thing that has been developed in learning theory or in information theory, where it's a set of tests where basically you're a city manager. And things are happening in your city, and there's a fire happens here, or something happens at the plant down by the river, and you need to find out if that chemical is okay and call the fire department and deal with the press. And so you're dealing with all kinds of information. You have to look up all kinds of information, and you're being tested basically as to how quickly and how well and how thoroughly you respond to, you seek out information, filter, sift through it, and make good decisions. So this is a knowledge worker test. And then what they did was they brought in people of all ages and had them do work for a week. And each day they could change what the conditions were. And they could see how they scored. And this is in a conventional office environment where CO2 levels are up around 1,000 parts per million, and VOC levels are in the 500 microgram per cubic meter level. And this was their score. This was the kind of baseline. And then they said, let's take a typical LEED building where we've paid attention to low VOC materials. This is what we actually measure through a lot of LEED buildings. But most engineers are still giving us that the ASHRAE 62 ventilation levels will result in an equilibrium CO2 level up here. And then they said, they found all kinds of correlations between VOCs impacting people's cognitive function, and then they found that CO2 levels impacting their cognitive function. So they said, we're going to do enhanced ventilation. And we can get some of the energy back with enthalpy recovery ventilators and things like that. Doesn't matter, that's behind the scenes. But we just want to find out, does it affect people's performance? And it's stunning. the group that had the best air quality with the lowest levels of VOCs and the levels of CO2 close to the outdoor levels of 400 scored almost twice the score at the advanced cognitive function tests as the people with what we give people in conventional office environments. We have presented this information, it's peer-reviewed science. We've presented to the clients who say they are not interested in that sustainability stuff, and they are very interested in this because they have employees and they are interested in productivity. And so it's changed how we're working with our mechanical engineers, and it's changed our materials selection. So thank you for Mindful Materials, because it helps us sift through all that stuff. This is transformative. Another one, this is a fun study that was buried in an odd session at Greenbuild back in 2014. I'm going to describe this, and you can already spot, we can play my favorite game, which is spot the assumption. This is an intriguing study. It's not definitive, but I'll tell you what it is, and you'll see where it's going. So these people are studying this big student services building for the University of Oregon. And what they did was they took pictures of if you were at the window of this building and looking out, because it kind of wraps around, and parts of it look out on a parking lot, parts of it face a blank wall, parts of it face a beautiful green, and so on. And what they did was they just went to members of the campus community and said, I'm going to show you pictures pairwise. I'm going to show you 2 pictures, and each one you tell me which one you think is more appealing. And with no prompting, they sort that, and you get these pairwise comparisons. And there were a total of 10 different views. And then they rank, and then from the pairwise comparisons, you can sort through and get a ranking of the most preferred views to the least preferred views. Then what they did was the people, this is the student services building, they got the anonymized health records, or actually the records of how many sick days the people had taken, and they knew where they sat, and they plotted it up. And they found that the people with the view that independently was ranked as the worst took, on average, 3 more sick days a year than the people with the most pleasing view. Now, you add that up over thousands of employees, it's huge money, right? And it starts to make us pay attention to that the effect of the environment, just at the level of what you get to see, seems pretty severe. Now, it could be, to my mind, this study is very intriguing and suggestive, however, it could just be that the person who's relegated to the windowless cubicle in the center of the building, and therefore has the lousiest view, is the person that nobody likes. And so that person, might be stressed and might be sick of their job and might take sick days for that reason. But again, this is the beginning of the kinds of science that we need to have done if we're going to make the case to an owner. The owner says, just give me a nice big floor plate. It's much more efficient to have a 25,000. There was somebody here who works on corporate commercial things. We were talking before the talk. And I've never met a developer who doesn't want the biggest possible floor plate. It's more efficient, they say. But efficient at what, right? So performance is getting more of what you want, right? And if what we want out of a building is to provide a workplace where people get work done, then that's the thing we should be measuring against, not just, oh, look, the amount of desks that can be served by this elevator stop. Because in the end, as we all know, the money they're spending on energy is small, the money they're spending on even rent is small, the money they're spending on salaries is huge. And so if we can have an impact on sick days, or people worry about absenteeism, the other thing to worry about is presenteeism. Presenteeism is people who show up but don't get much done. So it's another thing we can start measuring. So I've talked a little bit about numbers. So there it was. I'm trying to get my talk prepared to talk, the talk that I want to hear for you. And the New York Times 2 days ago has this image on it. And it's part of this larger thing about what was it? It was in the economics section. It was about numbers matter in money decisions, but so do emotions. But I loved that this graphic, powerful, right? Because it's what we do as architects all day long. We deal in the world of emotional response and experience and the world of numbers. So how do we quantify the unquantifiable? So why is this here? This is here. When I was in college, and I'm studying physics, and we're talking about how things can be quantized, and everything. There's a way of measuring everything. Electric charge, it's the electron. And there's the unit of charge, the coulomb, but it's quantized into electrons. But of course, there are the antiparticles for an electron, it's the positron. And so people started to say, well, let's name some other ones. So what about truth? How do we measure truth? And well, that's clearly quantized as truons, and then its antiparticle, the bogon, when something's really bogus, and then someone said, well, then there's the Napoleon and his antiparticle, the Wellington, and so on. And then we said beauty. How do we quantize beauty? And someone said, oh, I've got it. The Helen. The Helen is the quantity of beauty sufficient to get 1,000 Greek ships to sail from Greece to Troy. And, if you could just get one ship to go, that's a millihelen, right? And, if those ships probably carried 100 guys or something, that's 10 microhelens, right? And one guy going is 10 microhelens. So, the thought about, we all have these ideas of things that we all agree are impossible to quantify, and yet we hunger for ways of quantifying the unquantifiable. These notions of trying to find ways to quantify the unquantifiable. The interesting thing is this quote from years back from Buckminster Fuller. He observed that a lot of the technologies that he thought would be transformative into a kind of a sustained future were ones that were being developed to make weapons or other things. And he'd like to say that we're acquiring all the right technologies, maybe for all the wrong reasons. I'm going to show you now a couple of technologies that I think might influence our design choices. They're still in their infancy, and they're all being done for not nefarious reasons, but not for noble reasons, let's say. But they're out there, and we can start to aim them in a new direction. So let's talk telescopes. When I was in school, I was told that Galileo invented the telescope. Not true, as it turns out. The telescope existed as this thing called the spyglass, and it was used by guys on ships, and it was used mostly for military campaigns to see the oncoming army. So it was a piece of military technology. What Galileo did that was radical was he did this. He looked up. He took this technology that somebody else had already invented, he looked up. And the act of looking up said, oh, well, now I see I could make this better. He made the tool better, yes, undeniably. But his radical act was looking at something that no one had thought to look at with this tool before. And he looks at Jupiter and he starts recording, he sees these little dots that start playing around that you couldn't see with the naked eye, and he starts deducing the motion of, he basically imputes that there are moons of Jupiter. And so on. So he finds radical things. He uses this tool that was invented for a whole other reason to see something that no one else was seeing. So there are these tools that the people who, if you're really annoyed at how web pages are laid out, it's because of this tool. This tool is used by web page designers to find out where do they have to put the ad so it will make your eye will go to it. And so it's eye tracking software that watches where your eye goes. And these researchers have used this, and what they find is, perhaps not surprisingly, given that we're humans are fascinated with the other human forms. If you show someone a photograph of a lot of different things, and it has a human figure in it, the eye will gravitate to the human figure. If the human figure is close enough, and you show the whole human, it will gravitate to the face. Because facial recognition is really important to determine who is my relative, who's not, maybe friend, maybe foe, what's that gesture mean, and so on. So this heat map is where people's eyes, when you show people this photograph, this is where their eyes dwell and spend the most time looking. So this one researcher, Ann Sussman, thought to show people pictures of architecture and see what they looked at. So this is, of course, the Via Rotunda from Palladio. And she looks at, where do the eyes go? And then she does, instead of a heat map, she's showing you, she's just kind of de-emphasizing. The white is where you're seeing clearly where the eyes go. And maybe not surprisingly, people shown this picture, you'll look for the human figures. Because again, that human-like figure there, it might be a clan member, or it might be someone to kill me, if we're an evolving primate on the Serengeti. So for all these reasons, we have a lot of reasons to have this kind of visual thing. But then she plays games. She photoshops out the windows and compares where do the eyes go then and what do they concentrate on. So then she goes, was anyone here at Gulf Coast Green? So Gulf Coast Green, Ann Sussman presented. It was the first time I'd seen this work. And it was the most exasperating talk. There was like practically a riot in the room from architects because what she then postulated was she showed pictures, she did these experiments showing them kind of typical residential houses and so on. And what she noticed was the houses where the patterns look a little bit like a face are the ones where the eyes dwell a lot. because our visual system seems to be kind of pre-wired to go look for faces or things that are kind of vaguely like a face and figure out if it is a face. And then she showed them pictures of modern architecture. And she says, look, people are spending all their time looking at weird little edges and things and benches and stuff. They're not really looking at the building. Now, from this, she then launched into a screed against modern architecture by saying, look, this is why people like this kind of architecture better than this kind of architecture. Now, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between how long your eye spends looking at something and how much you love it, right? And so that's, again, a game of spot the assumption. Or as Mark Twain used to say, the wonderful thing about science is one gets such wholesale returns of speculation from such a trifling investment of fact. So my point is, though, I don't mean to dismiss her work at all. Her work's quite interesting, quite important. It's that she's got the telescope, and she's aiming it at the heavens. She's taking this tool that was developed for another reason and starting to say, what happens? Now, this is interesting, but they're showing static pictures, right? And we know that our experience of space is not sitting looking at static pictures. It's actually, we move through space. Things are moving, and we're moving through space at the same time. The gear for tracking that, she doesn't have yet. But I think as people start to study that, we're going to learn so much more about how people, where their eyes go and what their gaze is. She does some beautiful things on her website where she shows that on blank facades, if she photoshops in something much more interesting, here people they just look at this car and whether maybe somebody's walking down the street. But if this is on just as the photograph that's being shown to the test subjects, she makes something interesting to look at, people will look at it. Well, that's good news, right? Now, at the AIA National this year, Dr. Eve Edelstein, who is a member of the staff now at Perkins & Will, but she's been publishing for 20 years on, she's a neuroscientist who's been hired by an architecture firm to try to understand this connection between how brains think about space and design, what we could learn. So she gave a very compelling talk. And one of the things that got mentioned was people using brainwave monitoring tools while people are experiencing architectural spaces. And so this happens to be Bill Browning, the founder of Terrapin Bright Green, using this same equipment that there's a laboratory at Columbia University at their School of Architecture and Planning. And they're looking at this to look at response, one of their big issues is looking at biophilia, our delight in natural scenes. And they're looking at this to try to understand things. And so that's his application, and they're applying this to some stuff that's about to be published, really interesting work. I was going to try to play the animation of this, but there's this website, we'll send the link around. This is that group. They put these funny little brainwave things on people and let them walk around. And then they just log where they are and what happens to their alpha waves and beta waves, what's happening to their brainwaves. Now, what that turns into and what that means, they don't know. But they have noticed this notion of that, here they're doing mapping. This is in Dumbo region of Brooklyn, down under Manhattan Bridge overpass. Cyan represents the meditative state of brainwaves, and red represents attention. And they watch what happens when people come to intersections, and there's this kind of moment of confusion and concern. Is there something coming at me? And so, it sort of flips and switches depending on which ways people turn. Right? Again, this is the telescope. We're just starting to aim it up. We don't know what it means yet, but we're starting to look. People like at Payette have been trying to understand, every architect I've ever met talks about building great collaboration spaces. And it usually involves something that'll photograph really well. Payette was brave enough to go back into some of their spaces and find out, do the scientists actually hang out in the collaboration space, and do two scientists ever collide in the collaboration space, or are they pretty much doing their own work? And so they have these fun little tracking studies. You can go on their website. Now, they're not using advanced technology. They're using interns to follow people around and write stuff down. But you can imagine all the tools that might be applied in this area and what we might learn if we start to observe that. What it does is it gets us out of the world of always just saying, if we do this, it'll be great, trust me. And now we can start to go back to spaces and say, did that work or not? Did we, we spent that client's money on that one, but that client's a repeat customer, so let's spend it even more wisely next time. One way that this is starting to happen is this is another thing. This is not quite military technology, but the people, I told you about the people trying to figure out where to place the ads so you'll have to see it. There are the other people who are trying to figure out where to place the annoying snacks in the expensive snacks in the airport so you'll have to buy them. And so your phone all the time, it wants a Wi-Fi signal, right? It's always it's looking for Wi-Fi. So it's always pinging, saying, is there any Wi-Fi here? Is there any Wi-Fi here? And so when it does that, it says, and by the way, I'm an iPhone 4, and I'm this serial number, and I'm this and this. And it doesn't say your name, but it says everything else, right? You don't know this is happening all the time. And we love this feature where on G3 and G4, where it's why we can use Google Maps and it tells us where the traffic jam is, right? It's not people dutifully logging in saying there's a traffic jam here. It's just watching the cell phone signal uptake. In this case, this is a shopping mall, and they're watching where people are going, and when they move around the displays, how does traffic change, and do people stop more and look more, and so on. So that tool is already out there. The retail industry is using this all the time. What if architects use this service to try to figure out, when we design spaces, how are people using it? What are the spaces that are never getting used? So why are we spending money on that? What are the spaces that are incredibly intensely used? So why don't we do more of that, right? This is the tools that we're just getting to now. So this was the recent March on Science, although I edited the thing. Where do we want? We want evidence-based design, and when do we want it? After peer review. So I talked about quantifying the unquantifiable, that is to say, measuring beauty. Now I want to talk about feeling performance. This is even harder. One thought is there's been a lot of work over the last 15 years, especially in sustainable design, on getting humans to feel how the building is doing. It's like the building needs our sympathy, right? And out of the idea that if we understood how the building was doing, we might change our behavior in ways that maybe led to less energy use. And we know how this all starts out. You know, the gateway drug is a kilowatt. It's only 15 bucks. You can plug in and you can see how much power your toaster uses and so on. Oberlin College then talked about, well, how do we give people sort of an emotional response to how the building is doing? And so they in several of their buildings, they installed these things, the orbs. And these orbs glow green when the building's doing good things and not using too much energy, and they glow red when everybody's left all the lights on and so on. And I talked to an Oberlin student, and he says, oh yeah, those things were always kind of muddy brown, so we all ignored them, right? But it was an attempt to try to find a way, apart from charts and graphs, to connect to something a little more primal about how we experience and get a signal from how the building's doing. The difficulty that we have is the problem of democracy, which is that your vote will not change the election. But if all of us believe that our votes don't change the election, then a lot of people stay home, and we end up with the Congress that we have today. It's very important that we all vote. And yet the impact of one person's decisions are small on the whole. So the impact of one person turning off lights will be barely measurable on how the whole building is doing, right? So this is sort of the bug, the fundamental bug in this theory, that if we're monitoring the whole building, that it'll change my actions, it's the problem of democracy. Nevertheless, there have been beautiful interfaces, increasingly pretty interfaces. This is one from Lucid, where we watch how the production from the solar panels are doing versus the consumption of the building. You can flip through to other metrics. It's also the source of the kind of notion behind the lead dynamic plaque. This notion that, again, it's one thing to get a lead score, but depending on how you're doing with water use, if you're doing really great on water use, you'd be kind of winning all those lead points all the time. And so it's this thing that's built into the building that you see it, instead of just saying LEED Platinum, very good, I saw it on your entrance here, it would be giving you, in theory, continual feedback about, is your building really performing like a LEED Platinum building? Unfortunately, again, it's the democracy problem of your actions will have a relatively small impact. What people have found, though, that does connect with people is competition. We're top primate because we are competitive, right? And so what Lucid found, the thing that really is successful on college campuses is when they set one dorm against the other and pizza is at stake. Who lowers their energy use? And so these competitions, they do them at Tulane, they do them at a lot of schools. The challenge is that while the pizza is sticky, the savings are not. Meaning, as soon as the competition is over, most people just go back to doing what they did. So you must have continual infusions of more pizza, I suppose, might be needed. There's also a company that's a really interesting business model called O-Power. What they do is they take the whole data set from the utility company. Instead of the utility handing out light bulbs to 3% of the people, getting 3% of the people to put in radically more efficient equipment, they say, let's do something for 100% of the people and try to get them to be 3% more efficient. So what they do is they analyze your bill, and they say, here's you, and here's your most efficient neighbors, and here's all the neighbors. And they send this out in utility bills, whether you get them online or in paper. And what they find is fascinating. They find that the people who are the inefficient people, if you are inefficient compared to here, the average one who's identified as inefficient adjusts their behavior and lowers their utility bill by 5%. And I first described this to my wife, and she said, yeah, but the ones who are told that they're really efficient go, okay, I can leave the lights on now, it's fine, right? No, but it turns out that, in fact, they find the efficient ones are psyched and go, yeah, I can do this even more, and they lower their energy by like 2%. So on average, they're seeing sort of 3.5% savings from just sending out this piece of information of how you're doing versus someone else. And it's in a domain where you have pretty good control, right? It's your house or your apartment. So it's not like in a huge building where you're turning on and off your monitor when you're not using it. It's a pretty tiny impact. So this notion of social norms that's kind of linking to not just our forebrain, but our deep competitive, what is it called, the amygdala, the fear center and so on, the fight or flight response place, seems to be effective, only on the margins, 3-4%, but it's interesting. So we've talked about how to get people to feel for the building. But what if we got the buildings to feel for the people? Because after all, that's why we build buildings. We don't build them for themselves, we build them for people. This system is one we're trying to get into a project that we're in the middle of right now, which is we're doing a renovation on a corporate office building where they're complaining that they're uncomfortable a lot. And the problem is that the person who typically has control of the thermostat is, I don't know if you've met this facility manager, but I have many times. They put the plastic box over the thermostat because those pesky users are going to do something bad. They're going to ask for more comfort than they should. And we're going to solve that problem by putting a plastic box over it. And what they do is, in fact, you find that the majority of people would like a different temperature than what the facility manager or the CEO would like. And so as we have mechanical systems that are increasingly tunable so that every space can have its own set point, they're making apps. So this is the Comfy app. There's others out there. And the first one is obvious. It's your office, and you can set it, please make it warmer, please make it cooler. It's not about the number. In fact, I'm disappointed. The most recent version, they actually tell you what the temperature is. I liked it better when it just said, because a lot of people think that they're supposed to be comfortable at 72. And, but if you just say, I'm too cold, I'm too hot, they find that most people will choose, like right now, you're a little cold, I can tell. Most people will choose it warmer than what the engineer tells them that they should put it at. In summertime. What's really interesting is they're starting to note is, again, because your cell phone knows who you are, it's all a little freaky, but it's noticing that when you go into that break room, it knows that when you go there, you say, yeah, I'm too cold, and it adjusts for what you want. Now, what if we're in a big open plan area, and how do we deal with the fact that not everybody wants it at the same temperature, right? It's going to be interesting. So we're doing this office design where every quad of desks is going to have its own temperature policy. And then the interesting question is whether we can get people to move around so that some like it hot. The people who like it hotter can cluster together and so on. We'll see. But this notion of connecting to the occupants, they're showing significant energy savings. Because again, just like in the Bioinnovation Center, where if you do the lowest common denominator, or in that case, the highest ventilation rates, on the off chance that somebody needs it, you're wasting a ton of energy. If you're doing the lowest temperature in the summer, on the odd chance that one person likes it that cool, you're wasting a ton of energy. So we need to get past the idea that people are consuming too much comfort. In fact, I was talking to a great commissioning agent. He said in 25 years of working on retro-commissioning buildings, he has never had a case where improving the comfort led to higher energy use. He said, bad comfort is a sign that something's going wrong with the system. You should use that occupant feedback as the canary in the coal mine. Make people more comfortable, you will save energy every time. So, wrapping up now, I've talked about these efforts to try to quantify beauty, to measure the immeasurable. I've talked about the efforts to try to feel what performance could be, and so on. This notion of bringing together design excellence and environmental performance is one that I'm serving on the Committee on the Environment, the COAT committee, it's kind of redundant. Redundancy department. I'm on the code committee where we have just recently revamped the code top 10 criteria and tried to make it a little bit more modern, a little bit more responsive. And what we're now trying to do in EDR, we have won precisely one code award, but we have a little cheat sheet of the new code top 10 criteria. And our goal is that each project manager has to answer the code questions about their project. Not that they're ever really going to submit that, but you have to answer, just tell me what you're doing with water, right? Because again, this is the pencil diet. If you just have to, you only have to provide a sentence or two, but you have to say what you're doing. And you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. I was just trying to make it not leak. Well, that's good, but now the next step up, right? What are you doing with water? What are you doing for wellness and so on? And that comes together in a nice phrase from David Lake of Lake Plato, where he says, if it's not performing, it's not beautiful. And if it's not beautiful, it's not performing either, because that's part of the function of the built environment. It should be providing us beauty. We need that. We've tried to come up with a sort of simplified dashboard as we're advancing designs. We were in a 3-month competition, one of the 3 finalists for the Georgia Tech Living Building Challenge. And we had 5 different designs floating, and we had a bunch of teams, sub-teams working on. And what we said is we need a simplified dashboard for talking about what we mean is good. And so we talked about how much energy will the building use and how much will it generate? How much, what fraction of the year is it fully daylit? That windrows again, how are we spreading the glass around? What's the carbon impact of the building, and what's its site impact of the building? So we developed this kind of nutrition label of the most simplified way that we could do it. And we tried to make sure that whenever we were presenting, we had this numbers and we had the sort of experiential quality of the building. And we tried to force ourselves to do those things side by side. And that notion of always having that of those are your twin goals and you have to track the whole thing, it sets a bar, because there's typically in design response, you tend to work on one. It's like the guy with the plates. You work on the design idea and then you come back, oh, I got to go fix the energy. And then you go back to working on the design idea. And unless we start advancing them at the same time, we're not going to get where we need to get. So I want to leave you with this image. People talk about sustainable design. It's real hard, right? Getting to low energy use, getting to something of real value. And this is my favorite building. It's the Pantheon, right? It's got an EUI of 0. It's got an EUI of 0, right? It's 2,000 years old. People travel from around the world to come there, and they will do whatever it takes to keep that building going, because it's that beautiful. And it's daylit, it's ventilated, and so on. It all just works, right? So that's a great ideal to have. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Z. As usual, a very inspirational discussion. I guess wanted to open it up, see if anybody had any questions. Anyone?
Yes.
Gotta have one.
Yeah. Here you go.
I thought the assumption comment that you made was really cool. I actually I'm curious if you could kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think that could be something really interesting I can see it working in a scientific standpoint, where you're going through, reading your paper, trying to figure out how you can change an assumption and how you're measuring data. I think we could use that in architecture too. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Can I give you a completely unrelated to sustainability, but the idea that popped into my head is we're working on a school. And right now schools, universities, but also K-12 schools, they're all dealing with, everybody gets all worked up about gender issues now, right? And so what we said was, maybe we're thinking about the problem wrong, right? So what we've done is, in this current design, there's a bank of sinks, and there's a bunch of private rooms that each have their own door. And what the sign on the door says isn't, typically they say, well, should we label some of them as men and women because some might have a urinal in them, some might have a water closet? And I said, no, because men might want to use the water closet too, right? And what we said is, maybe the assumption we've been making is that we should be labeling rooms according to the attributes of the person. And maybe we should label the room according to what's in it. And so instead we've got a set of icons that there's a urinal and there's a toilet, right? And then you know what you need right then, right? So it was this giant case of, we realized that the assumption all along that we'd been carrying was this one thing. The other assumption was that we'd always assumed that ganged washrooms were more space efficient. Not true, as far as we can tell. As we lay out adequate rooms and adequate numbers of ADA spaces and so on, just this gang of private rooms with a bank of sinks, actually more efficient and certainly more resilient when you have an event that more women come to or an event that more men come to. You're not going to run short, right? And so when we relayed it out, it actually took half the, in this case, half the space. It was a relatively inefficient design we were running against. But I think we play this game all the time in design, right, at its best. I think Michelle Addington, who I know spoke here some years back, I don't know what she spoke about this time, but one of her points is we're always trying to make the building comfortable. The building doesn't need to be comfortable. The building's doing just fine. It's the people that need to be comfortable, right? So why are we lovingly conditioning all this air, right? A good engineer will say, well, I need to do better air mixing because the air up there, needs to be the same temperature the air down here. Why, right? And her point is, what we want is ideally is something more like the Japanese model where, there's radiant heat sources that are kind of following the person around, or insulation that is adapting to the person, and the building can be what it needs to be, right? And so that's a giant case of spotting that assumption that could be transformative, because increasingly so much more of our buildings are not occupied at any given time. We're all here. You're not at your desk. Why is your desk comfortable? It doesn't need to be, right? Well, we now have all this instrumentation. When they were first deciding, what an IP address is, the Internet Protocol address, it's, when you type google.com, it actually goes to this 12-digit number. And when they were trying to figure out how many digits that should be, they said, well, it's not like, all these designers were at this big conference at a hotel, and they says, it's not like the doorknob needs its own IP address. And they got back 10 years later, and the guy got to his hotel room, and he put the key card, instead of the key, he put a key card in, and he realized that, in fact, his doorknob did have its own IP address, right? And now we're in this world where we're all walking around with much more computing power than went to the moon in our pockets. And so it provides a mechanism whereby we can communicate with the environment around us. Now, if we can do it in a non-spooky way, that would be great. So I think that's the challenge we face. That's a great question, though.
Anyone else? I guess, Z, one question
Yeah.
I would have, you talked about using the, I guess the new standard for Code Top 10.
Yeah.
And kind of having your project managers, kind of do an assessment.
Yeah.
How is that? I mean, we've talked about doing something like that. I know
It doesn't come without coaching, right? Like everything else in life, you need someone who's asking for it before you'll do it. And so you don't want to say nag. It has to be a likable person who comes to you and says, let's fill out your mock code form. So hiring really nice people is important. But I think you do that already.
Anyone else?
Okay. Oh, Kirik.
Z, you didn't let us down. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The study, the cognitive function study that you showed, tied to CO2 and
VOC levels,
VOCs,
right.
that was amazing. Do you know how they measured that performance increase?
Yeah, it's this test, and of course that's the magic part of their study, is this test, which I haven't taken, where you're pretending to be a city manager. They have a whole bunch of references in their link where they say that this test was actually developed years ago for other reasons, to study learning and looking for learning. Like, it was, I think, developed originally to understand like training differences and so on. So they didn't invent this set of tests, because you'd be real suspicious. One of my favorite stories is, do you know why a horsepower, it turns out the typical horse can put out about 1.3 horsepower, and that was because when James Watt invented the steam engine, the thing that they were using horses to do in commerce was in the coal mines of England, that water would seep in. And so the horse would be put on that little kind of thing that goes around. It would walk around, and by doing it, put the food right in front of it, that would force it to be, that would run the pump that would keep the people from drowning down in the coal mine. And so their whole thing was, oh, we've got plenty of coal, because we're in a coal mine. Let's make a little engine that can run, that can keep the coal mine dry. And so he built his first engine. He got the biggest one he could get working. And then it was very important to him that it was equivalent to a horse. And so it just turns out that when you actually measure it, the typical horse can put out a lot more power than what we now have as the standard for horsepower. So I was a little concerned when I first read this study that they had picked a way of measuring things that was prone. But it does have kind of a paper trail or a link trail to these other standards that are trying to measure cognitive function. there are other people. This is now a rich field. That first study was published in, I think, 2015, and a lot of people are trying to replicate it and finding, support for it. I think that's, again, we're at like a really exciting time right now where we're starting to get our heads around this stuff. To me, the other worrisome thing I thought you were going to ask about is that they're seeing cognitive decay. One of my tweets, I took my little CO2 meter with me on it. I take it when I travel, don't you? The airplane, and it doesn't work at high altitude, right? Or you have to recalibrate for altitude. So I was on an airplane trip, and there it was in my backpack, and I pulled it out. After we landed, we're at ground level pressure. I turned it on, and the CO2 levels are like 2,500 parts a million. And think of how many of our senior executives, except for you, spend all their lives on airplanes, right? And a lot of them, they're making a lot of important business decisions in this environment that's like terrible for cognitive function. It explains a lot, right? So it also worries me that, when I grew up, we're 300 parts per million, then 350. We're now at 410 parts per million, right? In not distant future, 50 years from now, humans evolved. The average atmospheric CO2, according to the ice core studies, when humans were evolving on the Serengeti was 250 parts per million. We're now at 410. By most of the models, unless we make big changes, we're going to be at 600 parts per million. We're going to be at the level that you start to see decaying of cognitive function, and we won't be able to do anything about it because we'll be too dumb to solve the problem. So I think we better solve the carbon problem while we're still smart enough to. Okay, thank you.